John Thomas, how you be?
I am doing so well, man.
Man, welcome back.
Yeah, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, so we started off the weekend right, and we went and got some coffee.
Yes.
And what I did is I purposefully let you order first. And they were asking you questions that I've never been asked at a coffee shop before, and you started giving answers, and like you're talking about V40s and
V60,
V60, and like composition and I don't even know. And so you are really big into this coffee thing. Like you're loving coffee. Like where does that start? Where did this passion for coffee start?
You know, it started young, and it started, sometimes you have passion that has no wisdom to it. So starting young, I always grew up, my dad always drank coffee, and my dad, he worked all the time and usually second shift, so I never got to see him. But on the weekends, it'd be the one time where we got to hang out. We'd always do something, usually working on the car, working on the house. And we'd always have to go get food, or we'd have to go get pieces or something. And so we'd go stop at this little diner, and I'd get to have a cup of coffee with my dad over a plate of breakfast. And so I just developed this love for coffee. It was all these good memories, all the best memories with my dad. Almost always had this cup of coffee about it. So, but the coffee back then, it was like Maxwell House.
I was going to say diner coffee is pretty rough situation, man.
Cream and sugar and lots of it.
Come on. And then, at what point did you start really getting into what do they call this anyway? Is this like craft coffee? Is that
craft
what they call
coffee? Some people call it third wave. So first wave, it talks about the waves of coffee popularity in the United States. So first wave is like your Folgers, your Maxwell House, chock full of nuts.
This is like a James Gall prophecy. First wave, second wave, third wave.
We're coming to the fourth wave.
Come on. Forming a ladder rain together.
Oh man. And then second wave actually came out of Seattle. It was the Starbucks, the Pete's, that whole idea of let's have the coffee shops where it's more about the coffee bean. We're going to source the bean, and we're going to roast it. But what happens with second wave coffee, it's a darker roast, and it's created for the masses, which most people, when they think of coffee, they're thinking of syrups, they're thinking of the cream and their sugar, and they add all this stuff to it. And so to be able to have coffee that will last, that you can still taste the coffee, you've got to roast it really dark, because otherwise you lose it as soon as you add the cream and everything else in it. But then we have the third wave, which
so second wave coffee is a really dark roasted coffee. That's like a Starbucks kind of coffee. And is it true that kind of coffee ruins your tongue forever, so that you can never enjoy third wave coffee?
Well, no. I wouldn't say ever.
I kind of feel like my tongue is permanently burnt thanks to Starbucks, right?
Well, I used to drink Starbucks all the time. I was in the Starbucks so much. When I went into the local Starbucks, they would know my drink before I ordered. They knew me by name, and I visited. I remember I was with a friend, and we went down to Connecticut to do some ministry. It was from Massachusetts. I was living up in the Boston area, and we go into this Starbucks, and I order, and the girl behind the counter says, "You're John, aren't you?"
No!
What?
Oh no! Are you a prophet? No, I'm your barista.
I'm your barista. I used to work in Boston, and you came in all the time because I ordered the exact same drink all the time.
Oh my goodness!
Hilarious. So. But then I had a friend that had a coffee shop, and he started getting into kind of the third wave and roasting these coffees a lot lighter to pull out the flavor. Because the idea is coffee is a fruit. The coffee bean is the seed of a coffee cherry, and it's supposed to taste like fruit. So if your coffee doesn't taste like fruit, it's because somebody has done violence to your coffee.
So coffee should be fruity.
It should be some level of fruity. Now that could be citrusy, that could be berry. There's all kinds of different fruits, but it does end up having, because it is a fruit.
Interesting. So, and that's one of the things that I noticed is that when you're drinking coffee, you are drinking like you are discerning the different fruits within that coffee.
Yeah.
And that's fascinating. I'm not there yet. Yeah. I still got Starbucks tongue. You know what I'm saying?
Well, we need to hang out a little bit more.
Come on. Yep.
I just had some friends over to my house for a coffee tasting after I got back from Hong Kong, and I brought back all these different types of coffee, and I was explaining, okay, now taste this one. Here's how you taste it. Swish it around. If you ever been to a wine tasting, how you aerate the wine a little bit and you swirl it around your tongue to get different flavors. You can do that with coffee, with a good coffee. Don't do it with cheap coffee. It's not worth it. But with good coffee, you actually do that, and you'll get different flavors on the side of your tongue. You get different flavors at different temperatures. So usually you're going to want to wait 4 or 5 minutes after the coffee is poured if it's really hot, like fresh.
So now we're actually going to get into some coffee tips, into some coffee brewing tips. And
so we could do that.
Okay, and so like for people that are watching this right now and they're like, let's say that they're either French pressing it or they have a traditional coffee pot. What should they really be? What are some best practices for coffee brewing?
Well, we'll start with this.
We're getting into some higher level, revelatory, supernatural stuff right now, John.
It all has meaning.
Come on.
Well, the first thing that somebody that's just kind of like coffee is get a grinder.
Okay.
That you can grind your own coffee fresh, because that's one of the first things that you can do where you're going to notice a difference in the flavor of the coffee. So whatever coffee you drink, if you get a whole bean and grind it fresh, and don't get a grinder that has blades on it, because there's no way to get a consistent grind with blades. So you want what they call a burr grinder.
A burr.
B-U-R-R.
B-U-R-R. A burr grinder.
Yeah, which is basically two plates that are on top of each other, and so they spin, and it crushes the beans between it, and it forces it to be a certain size.
And these are like the hand grinders that you travel with.
Well, I travel with a hand grinder, but you can get them electric. You can get burr grinders almost anywhere.
And they're bladeless.
You can get them from Walmart. Yeah,
they're bladeless.
Yep.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Some of them will be metal. Some of them will be ceramic. I much prefer the ceramic because it doesn't take on the flavor like metal does. And so, yeah.
Okay. So we're going to burr grind our beans daily.
Yeah. Right before you make your pot of coffee. So once you wait 5 or 10 minutes after you have ground your beans, the air changes the beans, because beans have oil. Oil gives you flavor.
Okay.
And so that flavor, it's supposed to stay in the beans. So if you're getting beans that are dark roasted and you can see the oil on the beans, it's because it's over roasted.
Really? And I always thought that oily beans were good beans.
I used to think that too.
Look at the oils on these beans, but you're saying that's not true.
Well, because that's the flavor. So now the flavor is coming out of the coffee beans. So when you grind the beans, you have less flavor.
Interesting.
And so if it's a lighter roast, you'll rarely see the oils on it. You'll usually only see the oils on it on a darker roast, because they've roasted it so much that the oil is being pushed out, which is why you begin to lose the flavor of the fruit of coffee, and you begin to get the flavor of the roast of coffee.
Wow. Wow. Crazy. And then if you, I don't know, French press over traditional coffee pot, you think as far as flavor goes, or does it matter?
It depends on the coffee pot that you have. I've got a Mocha Master, which is it's European. I think it's a Swedish company. It's Scandinavian, at least, a European company. It's very nice. It gets the water to a hot enough temperature, because if your water is not hot enough, you're not going to get the same flavor extraction. Okay. So you need it to be at least a minimum of 185 degrees. Most of your coffee shops that do pour overs, they're using coffee that's about between 195 to 205 degrees. Okay. To get the extraction from it.
And what temperature should we be at again? 185?
Minimum of 185. So most coffee pots are not able to do that. The Mocha Master actually will get it to that temperature, because it forces it through steam. It forces it up through, when it drips down, it has a higher temperature. So you get a much better drip.
And you can get your Mocha Master if you call the number at the bottom of the screen, 1-800 Mocha Master. Make your coffee right. John, you've got this heart of a coach, just to be equipping and training up a prophetic generation that can hear God and represent God well. And so when it comes to kind of the state of prophetic equipping right now, and really seeing a generation really coming, I mean, we see like the call events, we see like Azusa now, we see Compassion for One coming out of Portland with Chris Overstreet, all these kind of movements, these evangelistic movements, but there really is a prophetic kind of drive behind it all. And it's really, really awesome. Yeah. So now, John, what are you feeling in the spirit as far as like the potential within the prophetic right now, like the potential for and the need for training and equipping? I mean, do you even think that that's needed, or you're like, no, let's just empower, activate, get them out, or you like, no, we really should be more intentional in this current season to be training and equipping? So I know it's a big question. Dive in anywhere, but what are you seeing right now?
Well, I'll start with a comparison, because the need for training. If you have somebody that is going to be pastor of a church or is going to be a teacher, I don't know anybody that would think that they don't need some kind of training. They're not going to need training on the content, the theology, their ability to be able to put together a message, for the message to be logical, to have a beginning and an end and actually have a point to it. And then their presentation, how they're talking to someone, their body language, their gestures, everything is part of that communication. When we would put a lot of work, and we would expect somebody, our best teachers, our best preachers, those that we would listen to, are people that have put in so much work in the content and the presentation of the message. That's important.
True.
I think that it is a disservice to have any less for the prophetic.
Interesting.
Because we're message givers. If we're message givers, we should be giving as much care to the content. We should be giving as much care to the delivery as we are to anything else. Because there's this weird idea that it's kind of in the back of people's heads, right past the point where they're consciously thinking about it. So it's not in their conscious thoughts, but it kind of lays back there. It's like, well, if I'm prophesying, it's gonna, whatever comes out is what God's saying.
Right.
But it's so not true.
Right. If I'm prophesying whatever, that's good.
It's not the way that it actually works, because God doesn't prophesy through a vacuum. If he was going to do that, he would just speak audibly to the person he was talking. He wouldn't use a vessel. He uses a vessel because a vessel is part of the message. And so our job as a vessel is to make sure that we're not changing the message that he's intending to communicate. And that takes training. That takes training in character. That takes training in presentation and delivery. We have to realize the way that we think about God, the way that we think about the prophetic, is actually going to cause us to communicate it in a certain way, not communicate certain things, communicate other things, put our emphasis in one place or in another place. And all of that is important. And so we desperately need training in all of those areas to get to the point of having greater impact.
That's so good. And sometimes I think in the name of equipping and empowering, man, when I get right up on these things, this mic sounds awesome. All right. Sometimes I think
I should get closer.
Yeah, listen to this. Yeah. Man, this is where it's at, John. Get right up on it. Sometimes I wonder if in the name of equipping, we can kind of perhaps empower people maybe a little bit too quickly, or maybe even maybe there's even some things that are being taught in the name of equipping and empowerment that are actually producing some bad fruit within the prophetic. And so my question for you, John, is what kind of training and equipping are you seeing within the prophetic that you feel like could actually kind of be honed in a little bit, if that makes sense?
Yeah. Well, I think that we've done a really good job at activating people at the beginning levels of the prophetic. But what we haven't done is given them a path so that they can mature. And so we've almost made the beginning levels as what the prophetic is. And so people never go past that. I was just at this with this group in Asia. And this group had been given prophetic equipping about 7 years ago. They'd never heard about, well, they'd heard about the prophetic, but they'd never experienced it, never had any teaching, never been activated in it. About 7 years ago, they got activation in the teaching that came, and that, multiple times people came to help them and train them. It was always the same. You say, "Thus saith the Lord," and you just speak out whatever comes to mind.
So they were actually using that model. When they would prophesy, they'd be like, "Thus saith the Lord, oh God," Yes, exactly. That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, and that was their model. And so, but what would happen is that there was no discerning of what was God and what wasn't God. Now, that model is really good for people that have to get past the mind, that there is... I lost the phrase that I'm looking for,
sure.
But we just get paralyzed by analyzing. Analyzation.
Totally.
We're just so constantly analyzing that we get paralyzed and we never actually say anything. Well, I'm not so sure if it's God. And you have to get past it. You have to get over that. That's a road bump that you're going to have to get past. And so you put on a training wheel of just throwing everything out there. But that works if there's a culture of feedback and risk. You have to have both. You have to have the culture of risk where you celebrate risk. You celebrate that somebody tried. Like, that's an amazing thing.
Come on.
But you also have to have a culture of feedback where you give, man, it's amazing you tried. Here's how you could do better. Let's take that to the next level.
And that's tough to hear. It's especially after you've taken a risk and you've given a word, and now somebody is giving you feedback on when you've already taken a risk. And whenever you go and you do something, you're always feeling self-conscious about, like, did I do okay? Right. So I think sometimes when somebody comes along and they're like, hey, you did great, but here's an opportunity for improvement, it really is a test of our security and our insecurity.
It can be. But the thing is, it's a test, I think, in the spiritual realm, but it's not so much in the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, you're going to be in sports. You go and you find somebody that's going to criticize what you're doing so that you get better. That's going to give you honest feedback that's going to help you to improve, because you know that if you don't improve, you're never going to get good at it.
Wow.
If you're a coach, I mean, you go to S&P 500 companies and those CEOs, how many of them have a coach, have some type of somebody that is helping them, a professional developer that is working with them, that is helping them look at the decisions they're making, the way that they're thinking, and bringing critical correction to it so that they can improve. And we think that's wise leadership, but we bring it into the church and we're like, oh no, you can't talk about my prophetic word.
So good.
Because we've identified with our gifting instead of with our God. And that's why it's hard to take feedback.
That's incredible. Now, what about being a leader and where you have feedback to give, but the feedback hasn't been invited? Do you think that good leaders should be assertive to lean into the awkwardness of that situation and say, hey, I've got some... because there maybe are leaders listening to this podcast that are frustrated with people that they are leading regarding what they're doing prophetically, but they're not saying anything because they're afraid they haven't been invited into that conversation.
Yeah. Well, and I would assume that if I'm the leader, I've been invited into that conversation.
Right.
Because my leadership is a stewardship. In the kingdom, you're not voted into something.
That's right.
It's not about popular opinion. God has given you a responsibility, and if you don't take that responsibility seriously, you're going to give an account to God for how you led those people. And
so you think we have an obligation to give that feedback?
I would argue that scripturally all day long. I think it is a requirement. Hebrews says that, it's talking to the followers, but it says, hey, follow your leaders in such a way that they can lead you with joy, because they will give an account for your souls.
Yep.
We're going to give an account for the souls of the people that we lead. And so if we allow them to continue in a path of destruction and we do not correct it, and their life is destroyed, we will help pay that cost.
That's so good.
Yeah.
Wow, that's incredible, John.
Yeah. And when you realize that, it gives you the fear of the Lord then you have to be careful, because at that point, once you get that revelation and that fear begins to come, the fear of the Lord, the proper, healthy fear of the Lord begins to come, you've got to be careful that it's the proper, healthy fear of the Lord and not just fear. Because if it's just fear, then you will overcorrect.
Wow.
Because you're trying to protect yourself.
Wow.
Instead of out of love to help that person grow.
Wow.
And so you've got to deal with that issue in your own heart. And what is the fear of man that would cause you to shrink back from giving them the correction and the feedback in the first place? Because really, if you really cared about the person, you would tell them. But if you care about what they think about you, you won't tell them, because you're afraid of what they're going to think about you. And so you deal with the fear of man, you walk in the fear of God, and then at that place, you're able to give people feedback. And when you give that feedback, it changes the dynamic. I was in a meeting, and this was a number of years ago, and I was teaching on dream interpretation. A group of people that hadn't been taught on dream interpretation. And somebody came up, they shared a dream, and so how I would teach, I'd have somebody share a dream, I'd interpret, and I'd talk about the principles of interpretation, give them some pointers, and then we'd take another dream and do the same thing again. And so this person comes up, they share a dream, I don't have the interpretation of the dream. I don't know what it means. And so I just said so. I'm like, hey, that's a good dream. I can pull out, like, this element can sometimes mean this, sometimes mean this, but I don't know what this dream means. And so somebody raises their hand. And this lady, she's like, hey, I think I know what it means. And I'm like, well, okay. I mean, you said that publicly, and so I'm going to give you an opportunity to come on up. And I didn't say all that. I just said, oh, okay, well, come on up. And so she comes up and she shares an interpretation. And I know it's not the interpretation of the dream. And so I just put my hand over her shoulder. This is the first time I'd met her in person. I'd been there speaking, but I put my hand on her shoulder, and I explained to everybody why that interpretation was the wrong interpretation. And explained, kind of where that came from and the way that she was seeing something and her perspectives. And, she sat down, we went on with the meeting. Later that afternoon, after that, during the break, she comes up to me and she goes, how did you do that? Well, what do you mean? She goes, I am so insecure. If somebody criticizes me, I'm crushed, and especially a leader. How did you do that? Because when you told everybody that I had the wrong interpretation, I felt loved, not destroyed.
Wow.
I'm like, well, because I was more concerned about you than I was about correcting you. And she felt it. See, if we can deal with the insecurities of our own heart, we'll be able to help people, and even people that are very sensitive, because we're really caring for them and we're trying to help them. We're not against them. They're not the enemy. They're the point.
Yeah, that's good.
And their error is not the enemy. Their error is the opportunity. And so we're helping them to grow. And they'll feel that care and that love that we have for them.
Yeah, it's so good. That's so good. So what are you seeing as far as opportunities for the prophetic in our generation?
I think that if we can come to the point where we have developed such a culture of activation, hey, everybody can do this, which we had to have, because that was not normal 50 years ago.
Right.
50 years ago, it was very different. It was the guy, the anointed man of the hour, man of power for the hour, and that kind of concept that was going on. And we've shifted that, and we see that we all have something to bring to the table, that the Holy Spirit has poured out as gifts. And we needed that. We desperately needed that. Now we need to take that and begin to grow, because all can prophesy, but some are prophets. And we've got to have more than activation for everyone, not less than. We can't let go of that. We've got to keep that. But add on to that some mentoring and training, because if we can grow into a place of maturity, then we're going to have the influencers of the world actually hearing our prophetic words. I mean, you get Daniel, who is giving advice to a pagan king. I mean, he's not somebody that is so seeking after God and he's hungry. He just realizes the validity of what Daniel carries. He recognizes something because he had matured. because he'd gone to that place of maturity through the choices in his life. It was about his character. It was about his personhood. It was about his understanding and his relationship with God. All those things came together where he was able to bring that influence. And that's what we need. We have the potential to have Daniels.
It's incredible.
To be a Daniel, you've got to get rid of the judgment of Nebuchadnezzar.
Wow, that's really good. That's really good.
Yeah.
Let me ask you, and hopefully this is in the same track of what we're discussing, is when you look at Kansas City, that became this incubator of the prophets. It was not necessarily an incubator, it was more like a magnet where it drew all this incredible community and synergy of prophets. And what my question is like, we've seen incredible apostolic hubs and revival hotspots established over the last 10, 20, 30 years, but we haven't necessarily seen that kind of Kansas City, prophet incubator.
Right.
We haven't really seen. And so what I'm wondering is, what dynamics existed there at Kansas City? Was that just a sovereign kind of thing? Or do you think that there are some principles and some values or something that was done there with Mike Bickle and what he created that made that either a magnet for this community of prophets? Because I would love to see those kinds of communities of friends that are operating in higher levels and, in our generation, in our time.
Mm-hmm. I think it was a mix. It was clearly a sovereign thing because, you've got kind of the three main Kansas City prophets that kind of launched the popularity of it. John Paul, Bob Jones, and Paul Cain. Paul Cain was hiding out in Phoenix, Arizona, living with his mom, and he gets a word from the Lord to move to Kansas City because this young man was starting a church, and God was going to use it to raise up the prophets of the generation. And so he moves to Kansas City and goes and finds the church. You have Bob Jones that has a visitation, and he's told, go to Kansas City because there's this young Michael, and I've put my favor upon him. And so he gets this clear revelation to move there, to be a part, and he shows up. And John Paul has the same thing. A little bit after those, because they'd come first, but he heard something about it, and he starts getting prophetic words, gets revelation, God's speaking to him, gets confirmation from this little boy that was a friend of the family.
Wow.
Sees him, you're moving to Kansas City, and prophesies this thing to him. So there was a sovereign thing that was going on. But at the same time as that sovereign thing that was going on, there was wise stewardship. And it's the both and, because we too often we misunderstand new wineskins. We think that we have to have a wineskin to hold the new wine. Mm-hmm. The wine determines the wineskin.
Interesting.
The wineskin does not determine the wine. The wine determines the wineskin.
That's good.
And what Mike did so well, and I've been in conversations with John Paul and Bob Jones and Larry Randolph talking about that history. I've heard tapes from the early days of interviews and people telling the stories, and talk to John Paul about those types of things. What Mike did so well is he moved the structure and how they did things with what was going on. They allowed the wine skin to be formed by the wine that God was pouring out. And so it was able to hold this thing for the period of time that it held it.
And what kinds of things did Mike do in order to honor the office of the prophet within that context? Because I just think of being a leader of a church and our desire. I definitely would say that there's an embryonic apostolic kind of thing that we're hoping to steward well here in Seattle. And so how and it'd be my desire to really honor the office of the prophet here in Seattle, and to have a safe place for there to be a community of prophets. So how did Mike do that? You had this diversity of characters and diversity of giftings even within the office of the prophet. And so what did Mike Bickle do in order to really honor the office and to honor these men and their distinctives and that kind of place, to create this synergistic kind of culture?
Yeah. Well, he would let the revelation speak into the direction of the church and of the movement.
Interesting.
And so there would be discernment. They would discern, but once they discerned that something was the Lord speaking, they would move to do it. They would begin to agree with it. They would begin to line up with that word to cause it to happen.
Interesting.
And they would consistently share the revelation as the reason God is leading us. This is how he's shown us this. This is this revelation, and why it comes together. And he did that so well in allowing that. But then he also, for each of the individual ones, he gave them opportunities that fit their gift mix.
Wow.
And so Paul Cain had different opportunities than Bob Jones had, who had different opportunities than John Paul had. I mean, John Paul had a calling to be an equiper and a trainer. He started to equip and train on the prophetic while he was in Kansas City.
Interesting. Wow.
But Mike was smart enough not to give him a Sunday morning.
Why do you say that?
Well, because he wasn't a good teacher.
John Paul Jackson wasn't a good teacher.
He was not a good teacher in the beginning.
Interesting.
He had to learn and grow. He spent years working on the content of the message and his delivery of the message.
That's interesting.
But he did equipping, and he did training, and then he would get feedback on that equipping, and he would get feedback on that training, and he would listen to what people had to say, and he grew and he matured in his ability to communicate. He became what we know as John Paul. But John Paul, I mean, every single one of them, they went through a process. We got to see kind of the end years, and we got to see the fruit of 40 years of growth. But there's a mature, very well spoken, very polished, very almost elegant, elegant in his delivery, right? Like, I mean, the distinctive excellence on John Paul Jackson and his ministry and his media, right? I mean, that's so different. So to hear you talk about like that wasn't there in the beginning, like that's so amazing. Yeah, and I mean, he's told that story himself, so I have no problem sharing that. I'm not exposing anything that was trying to be. But yeah, I mean, it was work that was put into it. It was years. It was equipping. It was practice, and it was being given opportunities that fit where they were at, so they could be ready for where they were going. And that's one of the things I think that a good leader, one of the things that they'll be able to do is they'll be able to recognize not just the potential of the people that's there, but where they're at currently, and help them, give them opportunities to take the steps that will allow them to realize their potential.
That's so good. That's so good. Now, I know I've talked to you about this before, but how did you actually meet John Paul Jackson? How did that all kind of come together? And when you met, was it like, here we go, this is it, you know? I'm your son, right? Like,
yeah. Well, the first time I mean,
you're like,
yeah, not really. Oh, and I'll explain the reasons as we go.
Okay.
But I'd first just been in meetings where he was ministering.
Okay.
And, you know, it was John Paul, when he ministered, could be very intimidating because you had no idea what he didn't know. You just assumed that he knew everything because what he shared was scary accurate and scary detailed.
Wow. Like
when he would begin to prophesy over people, I mean, he's telling them the secrets of their heart. And the first time I saw him prophesy, he has 20-some people he stands up after he got done speaking, and he tells them about their past, tells them about their present, and then tells them what their future is going to be. And I knew enough of them to know the accuracy of what he was talking about. It was unbelievable. So you have that kind of that piece. And first time I went to a prophetic training, and you know, I know the people that ended up coming to some of these prophetic trainings because some of the stuff that John Paul used to say then that he didn't say later,
right.
The people changed.
Yeah, sure.
So I mean, he was talking about a prophetic exercise. We're all going to be activated, and so you know, you're going to be prophesying over somebody. Make sure that it's positive, encouraging, comforting, exhorting. He goes, don't be pointing out anybody's sins. He goes, and if anybody points out or says one of your sins prophetically, I want you to come and tell me, because I'm going to have them stand up in front of the class and I'll tell everybody their sins.
No.
You know, he said that publicly.
Wow.
Talk about the fear of the Lord, because he could have done it.
Who wants to go?
He wouldn't have done it, but he could have done it.
Wow.
You know, so You know, I had that kind of like, oh.
Snap.
But there was something in me that knew there was something there. Me and my wife were walking one day, and we were just so hungry to grow. We knew there was more. And we knew we had to go somewhere to get it. Because where we were at, we'd grown to the potential that was in that arena for us. Mm-hmm. And so we knew the only way we're going to get more is if we go to some place where what God is calling us into is happening and we can grow into it.
Yeah.
And so we're walking down the street one day and trying to figure out where we're going. And one of us asked the question, still to this day, neither one of us can remember who it was. We both thought it was the other person. So maybe it was an angel. Who knows?
Right.
But the question was, well, who's the most like Jesus that you want to be like?
Wow.
And after I thought about it for a short period of time, I said, well, John Wimber's dead. So John Paul Jackson.
Wow.
And Donna's like, well.
What an awesome question.
Yeah. And so Donna's answer, well, where does he live? Let's move there. And that's when we made the decision that we were moving. So we moved up to New Hampshire just to be a part of the community. We had no idea we were going to be on staff or anything else. They'd started a church. They were doing trainings up there. There was going to be opportunities to be on prophetic teams. We were going to get to learn about dream interpretation. We're going to get to grow. That's what we needed. We needed to grow. This is our opportunity. We moved up there, and we started to interact with people just because we're serving.
Wow.
And as we're serving, then we start to interact with John Paul, and we get invited onto the team. We begin to develop this relationship, and I'm on staff and doing some stuff. And one day, John Paul's assistant comes and gets me, and I'm getting ready to walk out. And she's like, "Hey, I know it's time to leave, but can you wait for just a minute? This is like Christmas in July." And I'm like, "Sure." She goes, "John Paul wants to talk to you." And I'm like, "Okay." Yeah, John. So I go up to John Paul's office after this invitation, and he begins to explain to me how the Lord showed him that I had this calling to plant churches, and that he was supposed to sow into me whatever he could, and would I please, or would I be interested?
How old were you when this happened?
I was 30 years old.
Wow.
Yeah, 31. Yeah.
Wow. So he just starts telling you, I see this call in you to plant church,
right.
and you're standing there thinking.
Well, I'm thinking I've had so many prophetic words about planting churches and being a leader and pastoring. I'm like, wow. Okay.
Wow.
Well, I mean,
wow.
And I mean, this is John Paul. It's not like I'm going to question.
Sure.
Is this accurate? So I already had the confirmation ahead of time. Like, this is just the next piece of it.
Okay.
But the invitation was to travel with him wherever he went, and if he was going to be flying, he wouldn't be able to pay for my flights. But if I could, I could get there.
Awesome.
But anytime he was driving, I'd drive with him.
Awesome.
And ask him any question that I wanted to ask him.
Awesome.
That's a free pass from John Paul to ask any question that you want. Like,
do you think he saw at that time that you would be kind of taking the torch from him with the ministry? Do you think he kind of saw that at that time?
I don't know. I don't know, because I think not, for this reason, because he had people ask him, well, what's your plans? Like, when you retire, what's going to happen to the ministry? And his thought was, I don't think Streams is going to last after I'm gone.
Really? He would say that?
Yeah. And so he didn't have a plan in his head for.
He just wanted to impart into you everything that he could.
That he had, so that I could fulfill my goal.
Wow, that's awesome.
My purpose,
that's
not
awesome.
my goal, but my purpose. And so he was giving it, and he had no expectations. So after a period of time, he was like, John, you've learned what you need to know for the next season. Here's one opportunity, but anything that you do, I'm going to bless you.
That's incredible.
You can go back to Phoenix.
No strings attached. I've poured into you. You're ready. Now go and run.
Right.
That's awesome. That's incredible.
Yeah. And he did that a couple different times at different times. So that's when I took over the church. And then when I came down to Dallas, Texas to be a part of the staff again, which actually, excuse me, I didn't know I was coming down to be part of the staff. I was just coming down because I was stepping out itinerant, and
sure.
John Paul had offered to continue. I still had an open invitation to travel with him periodically. I couldn't do everything that he did, but I was still So I'm like, hey, I'm gonna go live where he lives, because
absolutely.
What an opportunity. And ended up being on staff, and he blessed me as I got so busy that I couldn't do what I was doing on staff. He's like, hey, transition, like, you've done everything right, go pursue this. This is what God has given you. And he held on with an open hand. He held on and blessed. Now, I think that he may have known at some point in time that I was going to take over the leadership for this reason. After he passed away, this is a weird story. I don't think I've ever shared this publicly.
Yeah.
But after he passed away, in his office, he had like his library that was kind of his study library. And a lot of those books, there were books that Diane wanted. They were specific for her. So she got first dibs. Anything that she wanted, she got to keep. But I was going through those books with some of the people that were on staff at that time. And part of those books was some of the books that he'd written, that as they would get printed, he would keep one of the editions just on a special shelf that was just the books that he'd written. So all the different languages and different editions and all that kind of stuff. And I was looking through them just to see, is there anything in them, or are they just a blank copy? Because one thing if there's something in them, a completely different thing if they're blank copy. And I open up one of the books, and in it is an inscription that John Paul had signed. And this is what it said: John, may you have the wisdom that you need for this season. John Paul Jackson. Wow. I about dropped the book, because he'd been gone at this point for months.
Wow. That's crazy.
So at some point in time, who knows what John was that written for? I believe it was written for me. He's not around to ask him, but
at what point in time was it in your heart to run with Streams? Like, did you feel something? Was the Lord kind of preparing you and speaking to you, like, hey, John, you're going to run with this thing? Or was it one of those things where you didn't even host that particular kind of internal conversation until after John passed?
I didn't let myself. I can remember when I first heard that he had a tumor, this thought process that goes through my head of, wow, this isn't good. He's not going to make it. What are we going to do with Streams? What needs to happen? How do we transition Streams? And I'm making plans for him passing away, and I'm like, no, wow, not going there. And fought through it. And actually, it was so real. I went and I met with John Paul, because I know my faith, how the gift of faith for me operates is if I have revelation that I discern as revelation from God, like, my faith is unshakable.
Wow.
If I know God said something's going to happen, I don't know that I cannot remember a single time where I've been shaken once I knew that God said something was going to say something. So I'm looking like, John Paul, like, what revelation do you have that you're making it through this? Because, I want something. I asked him that. I'm like, I want an anchor.
What did he say?
And at that point he says, I've had a lot of my friends that have told me that this isn't unto death and I'm going to make it through it, but I know how that works. They're my friends. Of course they're going to say that. I don't have any.
Wow.
And I'm like, well, I'm going to keep on contending. I'm going to keep on praying. He goes, me too.
Wow.
And so we just agreed that we were going to contend and pray. Now after that, he'd had people began to give him some things, and I've actually read all the revelations that were given, because after that conversation he started talking about revelations that, hey, I'm going to make it through this. This is why I got this word and got this word. And I think some of those were kind of friends, and some of those were misinterpreted. And actually I look back and I look at a couple of them, and it came to pass according to the revelation, but just not according to the interpretation of the revelation.
Yeah, right.
Which is interesting.
It is. And so after John passed, and there's all these conversations regarding what are we going to do with Streams Ministries, were you an active part of that? Like, were you actually on the board and having those conversations, or were those conversations happening with you out of the room? Right. At which point you were invited. Hey, we think, how did that transition take place? I'm always curious when it comes to transitions in churches and in ministries and those different dynamics. They're tricky. Transition is tricky.
Very tricky.
Requires a lot of grace.
Yeah. So I was not on the board. So it was a year and a half after John Paul passed away before I came on. So during that year and a half, that year I'm doing the ministry that I've been doing. John Paul had blessed me to go off and do. So I'm traveling full time. But whenever I was in town, I would stop by the office, talk to the staff. You know, I've always kind of been the pastor. Mm-hmm. So I just kind of go, hey, what's going on? You know, and hey, you know, that thing you're not admitting that you're feeling, that's burden bearing. Here's how you deal with it. And so I would just help people through stuff, ask them questions, and just, hey, praying for you, encouraging you. And the guy that was leading it at the time, John Crandall, we're still good friends. We'd just get together and over a meal, and we'd talk about what was going on. And I'd share, okay, now this is when this first happened, because I'd been on staff for so many years. I had so much context for different things, different decisions. I'm like, well, when we were dealing with this before, this is what we decided. This is why John Paul did this. These are the conversations that we had. So I was giving him wisdom and counsel while I was off doing my own thing. And I could just see from the pattern, I knew that the Streams had two options. It was either going to be a resource facilitator that would make John Paul's materials available as long as people wanted it. Kind of
like a tribute, like a tribute ministry. Like when you go to the resources, it's always kind of honoring and.
Well, it would just be the resources. So like the Art of Hearing God course, and you know, the teachings, the CDs that he did, the DVDs that he did, keep them available, and as long as people wanted them, make them available. Sure. When that no longer covered the cost of staff and maintenance, you just throw them up on YouTube, and they're out there for perpetuity, and you just go on.
Sure.
Which it's a great thing. Like that's a great thing, because there's so much that was sown into the body of Christ. There was rich teachings. I mean, and I've gone back.
Incredible. Yeah, they're
listened
incredible.
to some of his stuff recently, and I'm like, man, I heard that 15 years ago, and it's rocking me again.
Absolutely.
Like I didn't even get the level of it. So that was one potential, or it was going to have somebody that had a vision for ministry that was going to take it into a new place, and it would transform from being a monument to John Paul to building on the foundation that John Paul had laid and doing something new. And I genuinely wasn't sure which one was supposed to happen.
So those were the two options, and the board, were they aware of those two options, or were they aware of just the one option of continuing the ministry and just continuing to provide John Paul's resource? Like, were they aware of those two options, or were you the one that kind of stepped forward and said, there's a second option? We continue to run with the original vision, and we're creating new resources and keeping it present. Like, how did that look?
Well, they had made the decision that they were going to wait for a year before they made any decisions as to the future, what was going to happen. So they just left things going, and as it was, and Streams, the staff just continued doing what they were doing, maintaining, and there was so much to deal with just after that period of time.
Wow.
After that year was over, they started going through those they'd already started the conversations, but they looked seriously at that. And one of the board gives me a call and says, hey, what do you think about Streams? Like, what's going on? And so I told him those two options, and he goes, that's exactly what we've been talking about for board. Do you have a feeling which one it's supposed to be?
Wow.
And I'm like, well, my heart would want it to continue to be a ministry, but I don't have any clear revelation from the Lord one way or the other. And he goes, well, we think it's supposed to be a ministry as well, and we feel like you're doing what Streams is supposed to accomplish. We want to ask if you would take over the leadership of Streams, because we've been watching everybody that's been involved with Streams, and you're the only one that God has highlighted for us.
That's incredible. And how did you feel when they said that?
Scared and excited. Yeah, seriously. And I had to take a moment. It's interesting, because before I moved down to Texas, which at this point was 3 years before, we were moving down to Texas, and I had the practical reasons, but I was asking the Lord, like, where are we supposed to go? I just turned over the church that we'd been pastoring to our associate pastor. I'm going itinerant, and I'm like, well, what's the next step? I mean, like, I'm not just going to be traveling for the rest of my life. I know I'm supposed to build something. There's something for me to do. Like, what is this next thing? What's the next step? And the Lord said, I'll tell you the next step after you get down to Texas.
Wow.
And so we got down to Texas, and I kept on asking the next step, and I never got it. I got off of that phone call, and the presence of the Lord filled my living room. And I heard clear as anything, this is the next step.
Wow.
I'm like, okay.
So now you say yes, and you step into this ministry that's been it's called Streams Ministries, but it's not really Streams. It's John Paul Jackson. I mean, don't you agree? I mean, it's kind of like,
I mean, it was the tagline, Streams Ministries, a ministry of John Paul Jackson.
Right. I mean, you have Eagles View Ministry, but it's not really Eagles View Ministry. It's Bobby Connor, right? No one's doing a Google search for Eagles View Ministry. They're looking for Bobby. Where's Bobby? You know. So imagine that was an interesting transition, going from Streams Ministries, which is really John Paul Jackson, to now here's Dawna Thomas. So how was that transition? What was that like? Because like I said, transition is tricky, and even just being a pastor and going from my pastor who attracted very specific people to the church because of her composition and DNA, and then you have Darren stepping in, who's a different person, different DNA, and you know, and so there's transition, but of course there's grace forward, just looking at just the fruit and what you're walking in now. But what was that like, going from this transition from John Paul Jackson? 1 year passes, and now you're stepping in and you're thinking about the creation of new resources and these different things with your name actually on it.
It was super difficult and super exciting. I mean, you can't listen to anybody else's press if they tell you that you're the best thing in the world or you're the worst thing in the world, because I had both.
Right.
And I like, who's this new guy? I just miss John Paul.
Were there haters like that, like comments out there, like, like, who do you think you know?
Yeah, like, why are they letting this guy talk? He doesn't carry John Paul's anointing. He clearly doesn't have John Paul's mantle. And I'm like, well, no, wait a second. I have no desire to be John Paul. I have no desire to repeat what John Paul did, or even to repeat what John Paul said.
Wow.
Now, I have the vision. Like, the vision has always been the same. Help people encounter a God that's huge. It'll transform their lives, and they'll fulfill the reason why God created them.
Wow,
like
that's good.
It's been said in many different ways, but that's the vision: bringing regular people into encounters with a God that transforms their lives so that they fulfill the purpose they were created for. That's my life. That's who I am. I live, breathe, and I will die that.
And you're Dawna Thomas, absolutely. You're your own individual, your own experiences and everything else. But I mean, the impartation that you receive from John Paul Jackson is totally obvious. You don't have to be a discerner to see. And so I don't know if you would say the mantle or what, but do you think you received? I mean, are you comfortable with a particular question like that? Like, do you think you received John Paul Jackson's mantle, or do you think you're walking in just a certain measure of impartation? Because there's something that you're walking in where it's like, I mean, it wouldn't be a far stretch to say that you could be the biological son of John Paul Jackson.
A lot of people have asked me that and suggested
because of there's just an anointing on you that's so similar, so different. So, I mean, has the Lord showed you anything as far as like that? Do you recall a moment of like impartation, or where you're like, you know?
You know, I've had so many moments of impartation around John Paul.
Sure.
But not since he passed, not of impartation.
Sure.
Like, I've had dreams about him, etc. But but not that place of impartation. And you know, I have a hesitation about the word mantle, because the way it gets thrown around and all that it means.
Thrown around. The mantle's good.
Mantles
play on words. Yeah.
So I don't know if I would use that word, but I know that God called me in this place, and I know a lot of how God formed my spirit and who I am was through John Paul and through the people that formed John Paul.
Interesting.
Because John Paul spent a number of years with John Wimber, And he would point to what he learned and what he received from Wimber as key to who he was. He was one of the three people that he really received. He'd say John Wimber, John Sanford is another one that he considered a spiritual father. So he had these major influences. Well, those were influences in my life before John Paul was.
Incredible, yeah.
And so then I get the influence from John Paul, and it comes together into this DNA. So we have very similar values. We have very similar, even some nuances, passions. I mean, a lot of our passions. I mean, you talk about the art of hearing God, and that was his heart's cry for prophetic ministry. I could have written that course. Well, I don't know if I could have come up with the content.
That's amazing.
But it's in me.
That's incredible.
That when I teach it, I'm not teaching somebody else's material. I'm teaching my own heart, my own passion when I teach that. And so there's definitely some type of impartation. There's some of the spirit that was on John Paul is upon me. Like, Joshua, I'm going to take some of the spirit that's on you, Moses, and I'm going to put it on Joshua.
Absolutely.
I know that happened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That absolutely. And we're hitting on so much stuff, but I just love what we're talking about. And one of the things I know about you is you have a deep love even for the vineyard and for the vineyard movement, and that would come from your honor and appreciation for John Wimber.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so I just remember that when you were bringing that, like, John Wimber's influence on John Paul right. Jackson. And so what are you seeing within kind of the vineyard movement? Because it seems like there's God's doing a lot right now all over the map, and I know that there's just a deep love and profound appreciation for the vineyard movement.
Yeah, no, I carry the vineyard movement in intercession and in my heart. I mean, forever. I consider myself a son of the vineyard, if you will.
That's incredible. Yeah.
But what John Wimber, I actually just recently went through a recording. It was 12 messages. It was John Wimber on C. Peter Wagner. So C. Peter Wagner had written a book on church growth, and John Wimber had been on staff with Peter Wagner at Fuller, and they'd taught that together. And so Wimber did this big conference for all the vineyard pastors and leaders that were attached, and talked about what the DNA of the vineyard was, and how to grow church and leadership dynamics. And I'm listening to this. This is just a few months ago.
I'd love to hear that. Yeah,
I'll give it to you.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
It's free. It's one of those free resources. So
that'd be awesome.
I'll give it to you. Dude, it's so amazing. But I would listen to it, and I would sit there weeping, like, God, I would die for this vision.
Wow.
I would live for this vision. And I'm like, I signed up all over again.
Wow.
Like, all over again. I'm like, I will go for this no matter what. And that vision, he talked about how he couldn't actually be a part of a movement that was more about gathering. He wanted to be a part of one that was about sending.
Incredible. Yeah.
It had to be about the presence of God. Everything was centered about the presence of God, that making room for God to move and do whatever God wanted to do. That this idea that man leads the church is an abomination, that God is the leader of the church, and we've got to get God back on the throne. And he actually says this comment that I wouldn't have the guts to say, but he goes, I've been accused with splitting churches because I go and I teach about the kingdom. He goes, if I go into a church and I bring the message that God is the leader of the church and it splits the church, then good, that church should have been split.
Wow.
Because God is supposed to be the leader of the church, and if man wants to hold on to control, they can take the group that will follow them and go.
Wow.
I'm like, whoa. Like, I don't have the guts to say that, but God is the leader of the church. So that is my intercessory burden for the vineyard. That
That's incredible.
They would, as a movement, I know there's vineyard churches and in the leadership, like even this year, the leadership conference for the vineyard is Come Holy Spirit.
That's awesome.
Like that's their theme, and they're asking for God to move again in the vineyard like he did. And I'm like, yes,
that's
come
awesome.
Lord, let's go for this. Let's see this thing happen.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
man.
there's such a legacy in the Vineyard with their worship movement, and really what they contributed and shaped. I mean, most of the stuff that we're doing right now in our worship has been made with everything from even Bethel music to Hillsong, United, all, Jesus Culture. All of that was birthed because of the forerunners within the Vineyard movement that took worship to this place of where it was all about the presence. It wasn't about the performance. It was super simple. Like, here you had these incredibly gifted in musicians that could play incredible complicated compositions, and they dialed it way back. They brought it way back in order to create music that anybody could play. And there's such a worship heritage and deposit that the Vineyard made. I know that worship is a huge part of your heart and something that you've been kind of like revelating on, and that Lord's been giving you some different keys and stuff regarding even worship in heaven and the tribes and all. So John, what kind of pivoting here from Vineyard and that to your desire to see worship, connected between heaven and earth. What kind of stuff are you learning right now and really kind of diving into and meditating on when it comes to the worship of heaven?
There's a passage in Revelation that ties into Genesis, because it's one book, right? It's talking, I think it's in Revelation chapter 7, where he sees in heaven, he sees the throne, he sees the elders and the angels, and then he sees this multitude from every tongue, tribe, and nation. And he's like, who are these? And these are the ones that have been washed in the blood of the Lamb, and they have their garments cleansed. And so you have these redeemed that comes from every culture, tribe, and tongue. Culture, tribe, and tongue. Now go back to Genesis. In Genesis chapter 11, when the people had come together at Babel, and they were creating a tower that reached into the heavens. And I'll just throw out a question for people to ponder.
Okay.
If that was about the height of the building, why are there skyscrapers? It wasn't about the height. It was reaching into heaven, not reaching up to heaven.
It's
reaching into
really
heaven.
Good. It's really good.
They'd caught on something that, because of their unity, they were able to access, because of what God had placed into humankind.
And speaking into heaven, not into the third heaven, but into the spirit realm, into the second heaven.
Right. Well, you can't get into the third heaven without the invitation from heaven itself.
Through the way.
So you can access the second heaven, but you can't access the first heaven.
So they were accessing
the third heaven.
They were accessing the spirit world.
They were accessing the spirit world
to go into it through some sort of gate or something.
Through a gate. Through something that they were building. Yeah. And so what God did is he separated the languages, and he sent out all the tribes. And then in Genesis 11, it goes through 70 different people groups, and you can count through them. I was in Jerusalem a few years back, and there's a guy there I love to talk to. His name is Moshe. Him and his brother run a Shorashim bookshop in the Jewish quarter of the old city. It's just so much fun. Awesome. He's so educated on Christianity, the charismatic movement, and every branch of Christianity and how it all fits together. But he's an Orthodox Jew. He studies. He studies the church, but he really studies scripture. So he always has these cool things that he's been studying and meditating. And one time he's talking about the 70 nations and the 70 people groups, and how each of them were given an aspect of God's nature.
Wow.
And so God had given a piece of himself to each of these tribes and put it into the bloodline. And so each of them, they have an aspect of his nature, and they have a redemptive gift, something that was because of who they were, that they were given, that allows them to access spiritual things. So when all 70 of those come together, that access gives full access into the heavenly realm.
Interesting.
Which is what was being separated. So they had to be separated, but together the unity allows that full access.
That's fascinating.
So those were sent out. Now in Deuteronomy, because I keep on hearing lots of teaching on principalities, powers, angels, and so on. I always wondered, well, what did the first church, how did they talk about that?
Yeah.
And so I started studying what some of the early church fathers, some of the first 4 centuries of Christianity, what did they teach on angels and that? And they would always go to this passage in Deuteronomy 32, where it says that God determined the borders of the nations according to the number of the sons of God. God determined the borders of the nations according to the number of the sons of God. Now, the sons of God are the heavenly beings. You go to Psalms 82 or Psalm 84, where the Lord sits in divine council among the gods.
Wow.
Even the sons of the gods.
Wow.
And then he begins to bring them into judgment.
Wow.
Hey, I've given you authority over the nations, but you have not executed justice. And so you, even though you're gods, I'm going to kill you like a man.
Wow.
God says.
Wow.
So he's clearly not talking to humans. He is talking to divine beings that are part of this heavenly council.
Crazy.
That are not accomplishing. So we have these people groups. We have this divine council, and that's where the Jews get the concept of 70 people to make the Sanhedrin.
Interesting. This is crazy.
Because the divine council, the council in heaven, the council on earth, there's 70, and so it had to represent each other.
Wow.
And so this whole piece, and I tie that back in. Every nation, which means every place of the earth, the borders of the nations were determined according to the numbers of the sons of God. God put a people group in each of those, spiritual authority, a spiritual gifting, and something into their bloodline, but also something in the spiritual realm above them that all ties in together. When all of them come together, reveals the fullness of God's nature, but no one of them individually has the fullness of God's nature. And for the worship, the full worship that's going to happen in heaven, it takes every tribe, tongue, and nation. When all 70 of those come together, each releasing the unique gift that God gave them, the unique expression of his nature that he put within them, the full worship that God deserves will finally happen.
Wow.
And so I've been exploring what is the sound, because sound always relates to spiritual activity. What's the sound that God put into the people of the nations? And you go to the First Nations people, whatever place you go. I was just in Malaysia, and you have the Aboriginal, the indigenous tribes that are there, the Malays, and they have a sound that they have. There's like it's like a metal gong, but it's not like just the shield kind of shaped gong. It's like a metal pot. So it's got depth to it.
Interesting.
And it's kind of thick, and they hit it with a stick, and it has this really unique sound. But they also have this instrument they play. It looks like a huge longboat with these little gongs of different sizes. Each of them play a different note. And they were playing. While I was there, we're just in worship, and spontaneously some of the indigenous people run up and they start playing on these instruments, and this atmosphere of God came into the room. It was insane, because the sound that he'd put into the land, into the blood of the people there, was being released, and the earth and the people that he puts in the earth agree together, and that releases something in the heavens that opens up the heavens. So we reached an aspect of God's nature in that moment. And I know I've been to different places, and whenever the sounds that God put into that people begin to be released, their particular dance, the particular sounds that they'll make in worship, and the instruments that have given, it always opens up something. And there's a key to unlocking something for whatever ground you're in. When the First Nations people from that place begin to release their sound in worship to God, it opens up something that can't be opened up any other way.
Yeah, that's so good. And I think that one of the things I'm thinking of is just the whole idea of like models for ministry, models where there's successful styles that you can take it, copy it and paste it in your own context, and hope that you can develop the same fruit that another particular ministry has developed, you know. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's one of the things where we see where God is moving, is that there's almost like this discovery or this revelation of what you're talking about, of discovering that our identity really, really matters. Yeah. And in order for us to come into the us that God is forming and shaping, then we have to discover our own sound, because that new sound will release, that will be a celebration of our identity in Christ for who we are, and our own indigenous thing here within the atmospheres that we're under, in, and creating. And so I think that I love successful models. I love successful sounds. I love listening to music and watching movies and being inspired and allowing those ingredients to shape what I'm creating. But I do think that I so believe that we're going to see a move of God on the earth where when you go to each hotspot, when you go to each kind of apostolic hub, and you go to each kind of expression, each kingdom expression will have its own indigenous kingdom sound. And that means that we have to start being free to capture and to experiment, with the sounds in our different houses, and realize that it's okay to not sound like what's hip within kind of the current pop worship scene.
Well, one of the problems is the American church specifically has so taken on British colonization that we colonize everything. And so we take our model and we go somewhere else and we begin to apply our model, not our principles, not our values. We apply our model and we try to make it into that shape because we know what success is, because we're successful in our own eyes. Right. And we've got to stop that. I mean, we've got to stop that. I've done enough mission work in different countries and talked to enough people in different countries to realize how much damage that's been done, where we have people that come in and because they have some success in their context, they come into a completely different context, different culture, different situation, and they begin to talk about how they need to change to do it like they did. And it's basically like saying, well, you can't be anointed unless you speak King James English.
That's right.
Because when I first got anointed, I was reading the King James Bible, and so that's the only thing that's really anointed. And so, we get the model, and we've got to be able to go past the model, the surface, down into the heart and find the values. And then we can take those values and we can apply those values in any situation, in every situation, and they have a slightly different form but it's the same value. So it's the same DNA, but it's going to have a different shape because it's got to be shaped by the ingredients that are there.
It's so good. Yeah, it's so good. I mean, it's so interesting if you look at like Seattle in the 90s and the Seattle sound that people still remember, to this day. But then you go to New Orleans, and New Orleans has its own sound. You go to Texas, and Texas is going to have its own sound. Right. So each region really does have its own distinctive kind of sound, and that sound is created through community. It's a community of individuals with shared experiences with a similar set of values, and they begin to collaborate with their passion to communicate what's in the soil into the air. Like and music's so incredible, isn't it? As far as music's ability to communicate emotion without words per se, like just the power of melody and rhythm and how that inspires and lifts up our soul. It's so incredible. And to think that music is its own language and that every region has its own language. Yes. And so I desperately want to see the church become 20% more creative than in its worship expression than the local music scenes outside of the church. One
of the things I've noticed in studying revivals and having visited different places where there's moves of God that are happening and being a part of that is every place that I personally know of, there's always been a sound that's come out of it.
Interesting.
And there's songs that are written, and when the Spirit of God begins to move, the hearts of the people have to be expressed, and their hearts are going to sound different than any other collection of hearts. And so that expression will usually carry the presence of God more than anything else that happens in that area. And good. So you take a look at some of the early stuff that came out of the Vineyard and the sound that was released, and it carried so much presence and so much. You go to the early days of Hillsong, and the level of presence. The music was good, but it wasn't as excellent as it is now.
Their
level of excellence is, but the level of presence was so thick. You go to Toronto, there's such a unique sound that was being released. In Toronto, in Pensacola, it had its own sound.
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Every different place, Bethel, as it began to see things begin to move and begin to rise up, it had a sound. Every place I've ever been,
it's true.
That has a move of God. There's a sound that begins to rise up because what God has placed in the people begins to resonate with the locality. Because we're part of the earth, whether we like it or not.
Wow.
And so there's an interaction between earth. There's a reason that we've missed because we think of the earth as a thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the prophets were told to prophesy to the earth. Jeremiah prophesied to the hills. Ezekiel, go prophesy to the mountains of Israel, O son of man, and tell the mountains that you will once again yield your strength to people. You will once again have people walking on you. They will once again sow on you, and you will yield fruit to them. He's prophesying to the hills. He's prophesying to the mountains.
That's so good. Yeah, that's so good. I mean, I even think of I've been thinking a lot on Mark chapter 16 and the Great Commission as it's framed out in Mark chapter 16.
All creation.
Go everywhere in good news, everything.
Yeah.
With all creation, which is really, really interesting. It's not just make disciples of nations. It's go everywhere in good news, everything. Everything.
Yeah.
Inanimate object, nouns, people, places, things. I mean, I just think it's such an invitation to the church to start thinking outside of the box as far as the other thing I've been thinking on a lot is that whole idea of to preach, which actually means to publish. Right. And I've been thinking a lot about this whole invitation that we would be journalists, that we would be media creators, that media is just any sort of mass communication of the actual storyline, right? Of redemption and restoration. So whatever your platform looks like, whatever your passion looks like, whether it's poetry or it's teaching in a public school classroom, whether it's singing, or you're an IT guy, that you have a platform, that you have the story of Christ Jesus, and that you are to be publishing, to go everywhere and to publish, to make known, this incredible, and not just to people but to all creation, that we would go. I mean, it's such an awesome invitation to begin to create, build,
dude. And there's so many stories about how creation responds to the proclamation of the gospel. This was a number of years ago, and this is one of those weird stories, and I'm just going to tell you what happened.
We like weird stories, John.
Good. I'll just tell you what happened. I'm not telling you what it means. You figure that out for yourself.
Slap on some extra weird, John.
So I when I was living in Arizona, I used to love going to model houses just to look at them because it's just fun. I mean, I used to be a builder, and so how they put the rooms and decorations and dreaming. I was wanting. We were in a house, but it was always dreaming about what would it be like this place. So it was just a fun thing to do. One day I'm doing that. I come out of a house, and when I come out of a house, about as far as me to that camera right there, there's a hummingbird hovering facing me, and I just stop, and it stops, and it's looking straight at me. I'm looking straight at it, and I just decide it needs to hear the gospel.
Come on.
And so I start preaching to it about the kingdom of God and how God is going to come back. He's redeeming. He's watching over everything. He knows every feather, that the Lord is going to provide for it, make sure that it has food. And, I'm taken out of the Sermon on the Mount, and that the king is going to come back. He's going to make everything right. I began to ask the Lord to bless this bird, to protect it from predators, to provide for it, to give it peace. And it stayed there for 3 or 4 minutes while I preached to it. And as soon as I finished preaching, it flew away.
Wow.
But it hovered right there and looked at me and listened to the proclamation the whole time.
You didn't lead it into the sinner's prayer?
I didn't lead it into the sinner's prayer. No.
You should be now pray after me, hummingbird. Repeat after me.
Well, I don't know that creation can get saved like mankind does. Creation is waiting for us to get saved because they come into what we come into.
Wow.
That's Romans chapter 8.
Wow. Yeah,
all creation is longing and groaning for the revealing of the manifestation of the sons of God. we get the salvation. We're the first fruits of the restoration of all things. And as the full number of believers, of people that get restored, then creation can come into the restoration that we come into.
Yeah, that's so awesome. We have friends in Australia, right on the Gold Coast in Australia, and he was just like he was a thug, you know, and his dog was a pit bull, and he would go around beating people up, man, you know, like this guy, and he had this convertible, and his pit bull would ride in the back of the car, and if he gave the command, that pit bull would jump out of the car, jump into somebody else's car right through their window, maul them, jump out of their car and back into his car, right? So this was just a vicious dog, right?
Wow.
Just vicious, just a killer. And when Peter got saved, his dog supernaturally converted, and there was this new shalom and peace that came on his dog.
Right.
Not that the dog converted, but something inverted, you know, when Peter got saved there.
Well, he has dominion. We were given dominion over creatures, and so he's taken responsibility for that dog, so his dominion extends to that dog.
Interesting.
The dog changes.
Interesting. Man, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And how does that tie into us taking dominion over like creation? Like how does that tie in? Like, do you think that our role as sons of God on the earth, that we can actually that we can actually change the dynamics of creation on the earth?
I think there's aspects.
That's a big thing.
Well, there's
a big question, but
there is. It is. I think there's aspects of enhancing. I don't think that we have. Okay. We've been given authority to do within the authority that God established. Mm-hmm. So we don't get to violate natural laws whenever we want to. God created them for a purpose, and we need to understand that purpose and the right and the wrong time to change that purpose. Now, there are supernatural activities that God does periodically, but he has natural laws that he's built in. Yeah, so we have to realize that if we make it rain here because it hasn't rained for a period of time, where are we taking the rain from?
Right.
Who else is going to go into a drought so that we can get the rain that we want? Like we've got to realize there's a cost to those things that we do, and how is it going to affect the rest of creation when we do those? We've got to be aware of those dynamics, so we can't just be flippant about it.
That's really interesting. I mean, that ties into something that Jamie Galloway just posted recently on how we can override the will of God with our prayer.
Right. Well, I mean, that's Smith Wigglesworth, one of the famous stories. After his wife died, he was off preaching. She told him, "You better finish preaching because God sent you," even though she was sick. So she dies while he's gone. He comes back like a day or two later. I can't remember exactly how long it was, but she's dead. She's left on the bed because he told him, make sure, leave her there. He comes home and he begins to command her to rise from the dead. And after a while of him commanding and not letting go, like she comes back to life and she says, "Smith, Jesus said it's time for me to go. You need to let me go."
Wow.
And so he had to let her die again.
Wow. That's
Jesus
amazing.
wanted her dead.
It's amazing.
But he could resurrect her. He had to let her go.
And that's probably all he needed to hear.
That's all he needed to hear.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But there's a powerful kind of, because oftentimes we think that just because we're praying, that prayer in and of itself is enough protocol. But especially as we step into more and more understanding of our authority, there needs to be more responsibility to actually be hearing God's voice before we start warring in a place of prayer.
Right. Because if we begin to use our spiritual authority selfishly,
Interesting.
if we begin to use it for our own benefit, and Jesus gives this parable of a steward. So the steward of the household would be in charge of all of the goods in the household, but also would be the manager of all the household servants. Mm-hmm. So they'd be kind of the boss, if you will. So a steward, the master's gone. While the master's gone, he begins to eat and drink, get drunk, mm-hmm. and to beat the other slaves. So he's just doing whatever he wants to do. He's just fulfilling his own desires, mm-hmm. and it's all about him.
Yep.
Right, and the master comes back, and it's one of the more brutal parables Jesus ever gave. It says he cuts him in pieces. I mean, he's going to take seriously, like, you're going to use my stuff on your own benefit at the expense of others.
Wow.
There's a price that you will pay for it.
Wow.
You are a steward. You're not an owner. We're stewards. We're not owners. Everything that of the authority that we have, the influence that we have, the spiritual power that we have, it's God's, and we have to use it according to his ways because we don't own it. But we have the right to use it, and so we can use it outside of his ways because he's entrusted us. But if we violate that, we end up losing what we have.
Interesting. So let's talk about this for a second. Using our authority. There's so much literature coming out from amazing people on our authority, on the power of prayer, on the resources, on heaven's. I just got Patricia's new book. Haven't read it yet, but on heaven's the keys to unlocking the lavish blessings of the Father. And most of us, when we read these kinds of books, unfortunately, we're not thinking about unlocking heaven's resources for the betterment of our city first. Primarily, we're thinking about meeting and satisfying our natural needs first, primarily, and then with the abundance, then going and blessing people within our community and within our city. Right. So my question, because this is such a fascinating conversation of this whole thing of using our prayer, using our authority to unlock blessing that's selfish. And so really defining selfishness, and is it okay to seek God and use a prayer and authority in order to unlock blessing within our own lives, to satisfy the desires and the places within our heart? Is that okay? And how do we define selfishness, and how do we discern selfish motive within our own hearts? Right.
Yeah, I mean, boy, we could talk forever. Well, because here's the thing. Is it right to use your authority to get something for yourself? Yes.
It is.
Is it always right? No.
Okay.
It is not always right, but it is right.
Okay.
It's okay to be blessed. And Paul said, you don't muzzle an ox while it's threshing the wheat.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I mean, so when you're doing stuff, you're supposed to expect to get something out of it for yourself.
Okay.
If you're working for the kingdom, there is an expectation of there being reward, of there being blessing.
And that's not selfish. That's just
not selfish.
That's
the way that God made it.
That's a law.
That's a law.
A principle. Right.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. That God is lavish in his blessing. He says over and over and over again how he would take people to account because they've withheld the wages from their workers. Mm-hmm. Would he withhold wages from his workers? No way.
No way.
Not when he's telling people, hey, you've done this, and now I'm going to punish you for it. There's no way that he would do it. Right. And so as we're going about the kingdom business, we should expect to have everything that we need. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these other things will be added to us.
That's really good.
Now, if you seek first all these other things, you're living as a Gentile. Mm-hmm. You won't get the kingdom, you won't get the righteousness, and you may get some stuff, but it won't last long.
It's really good. But
if you seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, you should expect the stuff to come along with it.
Okay, it's really good. Yeah, it's really good. Yeah, it's an interesting conversation because we're stepping into so much more understanding, and we're seeing the benefits and the fruit of that. Yeah. And yet there's always the temptation. There's always that place of temptation of why are you seeking after this? Why are you praying after this? Why are you so? Is there a lust for? Are you lusting after something and using your authority to kind of go after it, and unto what end? And so these conversations are really, really important as we're stepping into more of a truly supernatural culture within the kingdom.
I will make a suggestion that you probably would never expect.
Okay.
John Piper,
my man. John Piper
has this amazing teaching on Christian hedonism.
Yes.
That principle, if we understand that principle, we'll understand how it works.
Yeah, Piper, he God is the most glorified in us when we are the most satisfied in him. Yeah.
And so we should work for rewards.
Interesting.
Because God created us to be reward based.
Interesting.
That's how he created us.
That's a part of our wiring. That's not a part of our depravity.
Right. That's not a part of the law. That's a part of our wiring.
Interesting.
And so we
That's
need
very
to,
helpful.
because God actually uses that. I mean, Jesus talks about the rewards. You know, Peter's like, hey, wait a second. We've given up everything to follow you. And Jesus is like, yeah, I know. You're not going to be without. You're not only going to get all that stuff back in the kingdom to come, but you're going to get it now too. If you've given up houses, if you've given up family, if you've given up this for my sake, you'll receive it back, and also in the kingdom to come.
Yeah, it's so good. Yeah, it's so good. And I think there's also something here, and we can kind of wrap up with this, but just this whole thing also where you can go to the negative in using your authority for selfish means, but also for the most part, the majority of the church probably isn't even scratching the surface as far as what's available in the place of prayer, in the place of our authority. Yeah. And so hopefully we are actually inspiring people to diligently seek after the kingdom of God and his righteousness. So, and all these things that are added onto it, and not just putting up caution tape as all over the place saying, whoa, don't seek after, careful, brother, you know.
Well, I'll share another testimony that'll give you this principle. Yeah. So about 15 years ago, me and Dawna were getting ready to move from Arizona to New Hampshire, and we're getting rid of a lot of stuff because we're moving across the country. Sure. And one of the things we had this car. It was a great car, nothing wrong with it, worked fine. And instead of selling it, we felt like we were supposed to give it away.
Awesome.
So we knew a single mom desperately needed a vehicle. We gave her the car.
Awesome.
Here, we want to bless you. Gave her the car. Didn't think anything of it. Wasn't doing it because we were trying to get anything. We just, there was a need. We had provision. We met the need.
Awesome.
About 10 years ago, we were pastoring in Boston. There was a single mom. Actually, no, sorry, single woman. She was not a mother. Single woman that was part of our church. She was driving an hour and 45 minutes each way to get to church every Sunday. Her car broke down. Wow. And she was part of our DNA. She was really going after it. And I just felt like I'm supposed to give her my car. And I had this car I loved. It was so much fun to drive. It was the little Beetle, one of the new Beetles.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, those things are they're pretty fun to drive.
I've never driven one.
Yeah, it was enjoyable. Man. Yeah. Curves, like it just.
Did you have the little fake sunflower in it? Because don't they have little vases?
I had the little vase, but I didn't actually have anything in it. I took the vase out and set it aside. But
sweet. I could just see you driving around, right, with the little sunflower.
The little yellow flower. No. But so we gave her the car.
You gifted that. That's awesome.
Didn't think anything of it. Yeah. That was I think I probably at the point I might have prayed something about hey Lord, this is a gift to you.
Sure.
I know that you give back.
Sure.
But never thought of it again. So last Christmas, we have this couple that comes and we're getting together with them, and they're talking to me and Dawna and say, hey, we feel like God has asked us to pay for your car insurance for a year. And I'm thinking, wow, like that is awesome.
Yeah, that's amazing.
That's great. And they're like, well, but if we're going to pay for your car insurance for a year, we felt like we were supposed to have a car. You were supposed to have a car to insure, so we bought you a car.
Because you didn't have a car prior to this.
No, we had a car.
You had one.
2 cars.
You had one.
We each had a car.
But they felt like you needed a better one.
They didn't feel that. They just felt like God wanted them to buy us a car.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, Jesus.
I know. No, it gets better.
Okay.
So they take us, to the top of this parking garage, and the husband goes and gets the car, standing up there with the family, and I'm thinking, great. I mean, Toyota Corolla, like this is awesome, Nissan, like we're gonna get a good car, nice. Yeah. I'm sure it's gonna be nice. It's gonna be practical, probably off lease, 40,000 miles. That's what I'm thinking in my head. And I hear this engine. I'm thinking,
like we've been hearing throughout the podcast today.
Yes, that similar, but. And I'm like, man, somebody's got a nice car. I actually said it out loud, and they kind of laughed, and I didn't think anything of it. Yeah. But less than a minute later, starts driving around, and it's this brand new 2018 Ford Mustang GT 5.0.
Wow.
Brand new and completely gifted. Yeah, man. It sounds so good. It's so much fun. Now, what's crazy is I have a few different times over the last couple years I love cars.
Okay.
I really enjoy them. I have fun driving them. I love looking at them. I love classic cars. And so I've just been dreaming, hey, you know, one of these days when, with no expectation of it ever happening, I go onto Ford's website and I build out the Mustang. And I thought about the Camaro and I thought about the Challenger, but I wanted the Ford Mustang. That's the one that I wanted. And I built the GT, spec'd it out exactly how I wanted it. This car was the exact car that I dreamt about.
Wow,
but
John.
Didn't even have the faith to ask for.
Wow, that's incredible.
But he had seen, now we'd sought first his kingdom, sought first his righteousness. It wasn't for our benefit. It wasn't in manipulation. I wasn't trying to make anything happen.
No.
But he saw.
Isn't that cool?
And he will never be in debt to anyone.
That's incredible.
And so he provided the dream of my heart that I didn't even have the faith to ask for.
That's
and
incredible.
He just put it on their heart. They didn't ask us what car. God told them what car.
That's awesome. That's incredible. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Man, I love that. I love that. God is so good, isn't he? God is so faithful.
It's just the goodness of God. It's just his lavishness. He just wanted to lavish his love on us.
And you're driving that car all the time.
Oh, man, I am. I'm loving it. Every
worshiping Jesus in your
yes.
just bumming out the neighbors, huh?
Yep.
It's real loud, huh?
I know, it's pretty sweet, man.
Yeah, that's awesome.
It's pretty sweet.
I'm glad you're not my neighbor, right? Like all my neighbors are old. Yeah. And they got just real, predictable, nice quiet cars.
Yeah, no, this is not the nice quiet car.
That's awesome.
Like when I drive into the garage, my wife hears me coming home, and it's not the garage opening and closing. It's like before the garage even starts to open, she hears me coming.
Yeah, the car is singing. The car is worshiping the Lord.
Yeah.
That's so cool, John.
It's awesome.
Man, this has been such a great conversation, and we've dived into all kinds of stuff, man. But I just appreciate just the freshness, the fun, as well as just that desire to build supernaturally, but on a biblical solid foundation, so that the fruit is healthy and good. And I also appreciate just your pastoral background and just your love for the body of Christ, your love for people, your love for leaders. You're the real deal, man. Just appreciate the friendship with you, and just looking forward to this weekend and just everything that you're depositing here into Seattle. So thanks again, man, for creating this time and diving into this. And
you're welcome.
Awesome.
Dude, it's so good.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And we'll do it again.
Awesome.
Okay. Pleasure.